Hey guys, so today we're going to be going over the third biogeochemical cycle, the oxygen cycle, and some of this stuff we have already briefly touched on in the previous two biogeochemical cycles, the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. So with this oxygen cycle, just like with the previous cycles, you do need to identify all of the different processes, both if you're given a description and if you're given a diagram. And then we're also going to look at some of the human impacts on this cycle. So the oxygen cycle just talks about the movement of oxygen between the reservoirs of the atmosphere, the lithosphere, and living things. There are 7 main processes that we're going to be going over: photolysis, respiration, photosynthesis, oxidizing and weathering, dissolving, and diffusing out. So photolysis is the breaking apart of molecules by light energy. Photo meaning light and lysis meaning to break apart. When sunlight hits the atmosphere, some of that energy that is in the light can be used to break apart molecules. In this case, ozone, which is O3, can be broken apart into oxygen gas, which is O2, and into a radical oxygen, also called a reactive oxygen species, which is a lone oxygen atom that will not exist in that form for very long. It will react with either another radical oxygen or with nitrogen or something else that's in the air. The oxygen gas that is produced is then available for biological use. That's like the oxygen that's floating around in our atmosphere that we're breathing in. So that leads us to respiration, where living things take in oxygen to use for cellular functions. Cellular respiration involves using this oxygen as well as a glucose molecule in order to produce energy. The energy is, in this case, ATP energy. That is the type of energy that can actually be used by our cells. During this process, we make carbon dioxide, which is what we breathe out during the respiration process. Photosynthesis is the opposite process to respiration. This is when plants use the sun energy to convert water and carbon dioxide into glucose and oxygen. So where respiration is taking in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide, photosynthesis is taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. That oxygen is just a byproduct of the reaction. It's not actually used by the plants, so it's just released back out into the atmosphere. Oxidizing and weathering are another pair of opposite reactions. Oxidizing is when oxygen molecules in the atmosphere react with metal compounds in the lithosphere. It's essentially kind of like a rusting process where the oxygen is going to bind with metals that are in the ground in the lithosphere, and it essentially traps the oxygen in the lithosphere. Weathering is then the process whereby that trapped oxygen that has binded to the lithosphere is released back out into the atmosphere. This happens as the lithosphere is slowly weathered away or worn down by wind and rain and stuff like that. As those metal compounds in the lithosphere are eroded or broken down, the trapped oxygen molecules will be released. Plants and animals extracting nutrients from the soil can also cause this weathering process as well, that can result in the release of oxygen. And then dissolving and diffusing out are also a pair of opposite reactions, which essentially describe the gas exchange that occurs between the hydrosphere and the atmosphere. So oxygen molecules from the atmosphere are dissolved in the hydrosphere, where they can be stored in the water or used by different aquatic species like fish. And then those oxygen molecules in the water can also diffuse back out to the atmosphere. So essentially, this entire oxygen cycle is a whole bunch of pairs of opposite processes and then photolysis, which doesn't have a pair. So let's look at some of the human impacts on this. The first is the use of certain chemicals that have resulted in the breakdown of the ozone layer. So that includes things like VOCs, which are now banned and not used anymore in most countries. But that was a huge issue that caused massive holes to open in the ozone layer. Deforestation, we already talked about in the carbon cycle, but essentially the more trees you cut down, the less photosynthesis that's happening, therefore the less oxygen that's being returned to the atmosphere, also the less carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. This has led to an unbalancing of the equilibrium or the stability that existed between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Farming and urbanization has also resulted in an increased amount of weathering, because essentially with both farming and urbanization, you're getting rid of like trees and stuff like that, which tends to hold, the roots of trees tend to hold soil in place. The canopy tends to protect the soil and the lithosphere from wind and rain and stuff like that. So with farming and urbanization, fewer nutrients are bound to the soil, and oxygen is more free to escape from the lithosphere back into the atmosphere. And then algal blooms, which we already talked about in the nitrogen cycle, algal blooms are caused by fertilizer use and other things, have led to changes of oxygen availability in the affected water. We talked about in that lesson the fact that following an algal bloom, the oxygen in the water is depleted, which can lead to things like fish suffocating. Speaking of lack of oxygen availability in the water as well, we also talked about in the carbon cycle the fact that warmer water cannot hold as many dissolved gases and other dissolved substances. So because of global warming and climate change and stuff like that, we know that our oceans are getting warmer, which means that they are able to dissolve less oxygen, which means less oxygen availability for aquatic species. So here is our little kind of diagram of these processes. So pause here for a moment and see if, based on the descriptions, you can fill in the labels for these arrows here and then come back for the answer. So photolysis, that is the one process that isn't in a pair with an opposite. So photolysis is when solar energy or sunlight essentially takes an ozone or an O3 molecule and breaks it apart. That is one of the ways that we get oxygen in our atmosphere. And then over here we have our first kind of pair of opposite reactions. Photosynthesis, where you have trees releasing oxygen, that's our atmospheric oxygen, and taking in carbon dioxide, and then respiration, where atmospheric oxygen is taken in by animals and they release carbon dioxide. The next pair of terms is oxidation and weathering. Atmospheric oxygen binding to the lithosphere is our oxidation, and then as that lithosphere is worn away, that oxygen is released back out into the atmosphere in the form of weathering, and then oxygen from the atmosphere dissolves into the hydrosphere and then diffuses back out to the atmosphere again. Okay, that was a nice, short, easy lesson. Let me know if you have any questions.